this is the thing I think that we miss. We find it very hard to have multiple viewpoints because we are conditioned in our age to think that truth only comes through one kind of way of knowing. When it's typically that's what we just focus on. How do we know it's true? Because it's a fact in this kind of way. But the Bible is, if anything, it's a little library that shows us that truth must be held in play the whole time. It comes through narrative, it comes through story, it comes through parables, it comes through propositional ways of knowing. But if you elevate one of those, you miss the rest. Mm-hmm. So we need to become nimble thinkers again.
That's right. That's
nimble
nice.
Truth players.
Yeah.
Thinking about what a day it is. I could think it almost anywhere.
Kia ora koutou and welcome to Lunch on the Way. Today's conversation is a bonus episode all the way from, I think, January or February of 2024. So about a year and a half ago, Graeme, Jonathan, and I sat down, recorded something, and at the time, we didn't really like it very much. I'm not entirely sure why. After listening back to it, I kind of liked the conversation we had, and because of that, I'm publishing it right now because I think it is still pertinent and helpful today. And if this is the middle of winter for you or the middle of summer for you, depending on where you are at in the world, consider this a midwinter or midsummer gift. Well, thank you so much for listening and being a part of the conversation on Lunch on the Way. And if you'd like to show your support, you can leave a review on whatever podcasting platform you use. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can leave a like and a comment. And the music you're listening to is by my friend Josiah David Swim, and you can find him on Spotify. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Koto, welcome to Lunch on the Way. We're three guys doing theology over lunch, and sometimes we do that with others. And I have to warn you, though, that what's said here is not yet complete, because like any good conversation, you never really want it to end. So please join us for Lunch on the Way, joined by Jonathan and Graeme. And today is a bit of a different episode. Might not even publish it. We'll figure that out soon, because we're going to talk about the event that we're going to do in November and actually are planning around it. And the reason why we might publish this, and while we're recording it now, is because we're talking about what really matters and what's important. And essentially, that's what we're hoping to convey at this event that we're participating in, and we're helping to cultivate conversations with pastors over in Tauranga, and we're just going to frame it and see what happens. Cool. All right?
Yeah. Let's do it.
All right, Graeme. So what's going on?
Let's get the context. That's a good place to start. So the context is Nigel Dixon, Vicar of Holy Trinity Tauranga, has, I think it's about every 3 months, he does what he calls the leadership, it's a leadership network, he calls it, something like that. Mm-hmm. And so he basically gets somebody in each time. I think May has done this.
Okay.
And I think she did it on spiritual formation sort of stuff. And so Nigel's had asked me for a while, will you do something? And I thought, actually, and so I rang him the other day and said to him, I talked to you guys. Mm-hmm. He said, I really like the sound of that. So so that's what we're going to do. So what are we going to do down there? So I sort of said to him, look, this is not sort of absolutely clear for us yet, but there's themes around that we'd kind of like to talk about. I said I have talked to him before about the notion of, so one of the things about pastoral ministry is just how to be human. How do we respond in ways to our congregations in terms of leadership? About, I guess the theological thing is to be Christian is to be fully human. The kind of line of Irenaeus, we're the new Adam. So what does that look like? Christ is the fullness of humanity. So what does it look like for in pastoral ministry and leadership to be fully human? How does that play out? So that was kind of he quite liked that, sort of notion of Christian anthropology sitting in the mix. Yeah. I think there are other things around that as well. We have talked about the importance of metaphor for ministry. Yeah. We've also talked about power. So to me, there's a number of things. How do we frame that? Yeah.
So, but the overarching thing is, what does it mean to be human? And the assumption is to be Christian is to be but it's not exclusive, because clearly you can not be Christian in a dogmatic sense and be human. Obviously, you're not alien, but to be more of who you're supposed to be.
Right.
Well, I think that sort of comes out of conversations that you and I have had, Jonathan. I might have had them with you a little bit too, Joey. Is that a couple of years ago, being really conscious of that, what's going on is some of the behaviours are the way in which people sort of play into the space. Is like, oh, this is really Christian, but it doesn't look very human. So there's a really big disconnect for me. Yeah. And when people are kind of doing all this sort of Christian stuff, and you're going, I wouldn't treat my dog like that. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, so there's this sort of, I think there's a disconnect between those two ideas.
Yeah. Can you give an example?
The way in which, the way in which power might work. A leader might exercise power and treat, I could think of illustrations nearer at home, but
can I
you have to hear that one.
I'll leave those for later.
I can fill that one out a bit more. So a classic one would be where we would say, in principle, people are more important, are the most important thing. Mm-hmm. Like, we're here to serve people, but sometimes we can be caught up in the system of ministry of being Christian to where people are seen as just an element or a cog or in the machine or in the process. Yeah. Where what's the term? What's the phrase? Efficient causality seems to be the most important thing over the people. Yeah. Where I would argue that the end result isn't actually the most important thing most of the time. Yeah. The process is typically more important, because the process actually forms people. Yeah. Anyway, so you would say that would be an example.
So yes, and that plays into that. Underneath that is exactly that. That idea of efficient causality seems to be the only causality that we think about. Yeah. We're not thinking more broadly about, because what happens with that is, this is the goal here. We've got to get there, and so people are expendable in the process. Yeah. And the raw reality is that's part of a bigger problem, is that we've got hoots of people not going to church anymore because they've been killed off. Yeah.
So is a question that we're going to get at then, first of all, to kind of lay a foundation of what is a human being. Yeah. So what do we think it is to be human at all? Yeah. And then are the ways that we're running our churches and the way that we've set the churches up, are they for human beings, or are they for something else? You know, do they make us more human, or do they dehumanize us? Yeah. And then kind of running that through a grid of what we think it is to be human in the first place. Yeah. Is that kind of right?
Yeah, that's fair. So so to begin with the personal, to move out into the body of Christ. Yeah. And then the local church expression of that. Yeah. Yeah. And then to see kind of what's going on. Yeah. And not to be critical, but just to ask some questions, because what are we hoping that this is? It's we obviously would say or present something, but then it's a dialogue as well, right?
Yeah. Yes, it's a dialogue, and I thought I talked to Nigel about how we might do that. Yep. That we might do it as like we would discuss between the three of us, and then we would have some questions for them at the table that they would work with, and then we'd have come back to us with sort of a dialogue, and there would be three of those. That's how we'd probably do it. When I think about the time, there's a 10 o'clock, there's a sort of 11 o'clock. And then there's an after lunch, so there's 3 sessions.
Okay, so it's kind of packed within 10 to 2:30 kind of time.
Yep.
Cool. So we can get home for dinner.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's quite succinct. There's not as much time as you think we've got.
No.
Yeah.
But I think the richness would be. I think the richness is this kind of interplay that makes it very dynamic. The opportunity where there's some questions at their tables, where they're talking about that, and then the opportunity to come back at us with questions or their ideas. What do they come up with? What do they see?
Yeah, we could also frame that what we're doing here is modeling what it is to be human.
Yes.
So instead of just having the speaker at the front, we're also saying, well, maybe that's not as human as we've made it out to be, and this is another way of modeling what it is to be human.
Yeah. Well, there's also a modeling about what wisdom is too here,
and wisdom, and how we discern that, and how we come to it.
The wisdom is in, I was talking to John about this the other day, because I don't think I made a particularly good job of that, but because I ran out of time. But in the capstone course, I just wanted to put them, look, part of this is a conversation we're doing in this capstone course, because actually wisdom it's dynamic. It's not an object that you can go, this is this.
Yeah.
It's actually the posture of actually leaning and listening to each other's space. And in our conversation, there's something that emerges that is beautiful and good.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
and that's in the Proverbs,
absolutely.
It's so deeply ground into that. And I was talking to John about the other day, and he says, this is exactly Proverbs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think the idea of a Sunday morning monologue, what pastors try and do is they try and turn that into small group discussions, which they hope that kind of happens.
Yeah.
But I don't think it happens. It depends on who's in the room for how well it can happen or not. To open discussions around something.
Yeah.
But like how am I going to say this? Being a part of a smaller group of people, like for example the three of us. Like if there was a fourth person, that would change the dynamic of the conversation. If there was a fifth, it then moves into a small gathering.
Yeah, true.
But the fact that it's three people, it's small, and you're having very open conversations about virtually anything.
Yeah.
And trying to work through process, I think that actually matters. So I wonder, how big do we want the groups to be in that sense?
Well, they're usually 3 to 5.
3 to 5.
That's okay.
Yeah, because if it was, that's fairly fair. If it was 8, I'm like, okay.
Yeah, no, I think group at 8.
You can't get anywhere.
3 to 5 is okay.
Yeah, I think ideally 3, 5 at the most.
Yeah, we can say that.
Yeah, I think that would be good because there's more. I think you can actually, with less people, there's a vulnerability that happens, and there's an openness that people kind of implicitly kind of sense.
Yeah,
and can So
you usually have about 35 to 40 of this.
Yeah, that's a good,
which is not a bad number.
Amount of people.
It's our whole podcasting audience.
Just
so kidding. We're bigger than
that. Nigel was quite. He thought, I quite like this. I said, what's the pedagogy that we're thinking about?
Yeah,
but I think it's
exactly
I think
right.
you've got a really good point there. It's actually what we're modelling here. Too.
I think so.
It's as much as the medium as the message.
Yeah, the medium
definitely.
Is.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah, so we're not just sort of turning up as the expert
on
a podium.
Far from it.
We're actually having a conversation. We're asking you to be part of this conversation.
Yeah,
and we're not saying we've got it right.
Yeah,
we're prodding and provoking.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think an emphasis on the provoke.
Yeah.
Not that we want to emphasize provocation. But that I think some of the things that are reflected upon will be provoking. Mm-hmm. Because one of the reflections that a pastor friend of mine has around these types of critical thoughts and theological reflections is that he realizes that if he begins to have conversations like this, that people will be provoked because it will actually, in the moment, even though it might not ultimately, in the moment might undermine the very ministry philosophy they've held for so long.
Right, yeah.
And that can be very disruptive.
Yeah.
And that's not a process that can kind of change over an event.
No.
That's like years of processing,
that's
right?
Right, yeah.
And it's not even, like, I think in our conversation, Graeme, when we talked about theological reflection 2 episodes ago, I said that the process that I've gone on with theological reflection, especially since moving here and being in conversation with both of you, it's not that I've actually radically changed how I do ministry. It's just that I actually have a new why behind why I do what I do, which then I'm emphasizing certain things and I have a sharper point in different things than I used to. Right. But really, if you looked externally out, from the outside in, you might be like, well, Joey, you've changed almost nothing. It's like, well, no, the why behind what I'm doing is way more concrete now than it ever has been.
Right.
And I value certain things more than others. Yeah. Even though, I still preach on Sunday mornings.
Yeah.
I still lead ministry teams. I'm still doing that kind of work. Yep. It's just different. It feels different.
Yeah.
So, but you don't think that you could get to that point if you're really disrupted in the moment and provoked in the moment. You're just like, I don't want to be a part of this conversation. It's undermining everything that I'm doing. It's like, no. We're just asking questions because who's the philosopher who said this? An unexamined life is a life not worth living.
Socrates.
Yeah. There we go.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we're doing. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mean, part of that is breaking the how do you call it, the crust
Yeah, that's
the
right.
crust
That's
of
how I
our
see it as well.
of one of the things that we suffer from in Western culture is a lack of imagination, and we certainly suffer it from the church.
Yep.
So how do you begin to break the crust of that? And I think that's by asking questions. And yes, that it can be intimidating, but the idea here is not to deconstruct
No.
everything. It's faith leaning forward. I think we've used that phrase before.
Yep.
But it's needful for us to do that. Jesus asked questions and didn't always get a good audience either.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly right.
Yeah. So I think it is a faith posture for us to do this, to be curious, to ask questions.
Yeah.
And this helps us grow. This is basic. I mean, so I was saying to somebody the other day, it was a student.
No.
And he's an interesting guy. He's done, a music degree. He's done linguistics.
Right.
He was a student here in the early 80s.
Okay.
And then he's been on this big long journey,
Yeah.
And he says, I don't know if I'm going to I don't know how I'm going to go here. And he said, but I'm curious. And I said, that's a gift. Do you think so? I said, that's to be human, is to be curious.
Yeah.
He said,
I love guys like
I
that.
can't help
That's a
myself. He said,
great
I have
point.
to ask questions. I said,
Yeah, that's awesome.
I said, yes.
Yep.
You hopefully you find a space here.
Yeah,
You can ask
absolutely.
questions.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I know you're talking about. And
Yeah.
It's always exciting when people like that come around.
Oh,
who
it is.
Who have a wealth of life experience, but then are open to really
Yeah.
examining everything.
Yeah. And just the little conversations we had,
Yep.
And we talked a little bit about mystery, and he was going, oh, this is good. He said, yeah, So there's a space in which that feels very fertile ground.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So,
Fertile ground. Yeah.
no, there we go.
right.
Good metaphor, Graeme.
Yeah.
Speaking of metaphors.
So yeah, where do we start?
So if we're thinking, what does it mean to be human, church, local church? If we're going like from inside to big, then back kind of to local church.
Right.
Clearly, story, narrative, and metaphor is a piece of that as to what does it mean to be human. Like, how do we actually learn? How
Story,
are we
narrative, and metaphor.
Yeah. How do we actually learn? How do we actually live into something? Like to be human is to be storied. I don't think you can escape that. There's always a narrative that we're living into. And one thing I've been reflecting on, this might not be useful at all, I don't know, is people always ask the question, why did Jesus always tell stories and parables and use metaphors? Why didn't he just teach plainly? Well, the Gospel of John does to a certain extent, but it really doesn't, because a lot of images are used still within the teaching that make it a bit cryptic. And Jesus does his own self-explanation where he says, well, because not everyone has eyes to see or ears to hear, I speak ununderstandably so that the people who really want to lean in can lean in a sense. But I think, obviously that's true because Jesus said that. But I think the second thing, another observation I've had is because the best way for us to understand the world is actually through story and images and metaphors. Like if people theologians are like, I wish Jesus just laid out what he meant by the Father, by himself as the Son, and by the Spirit. I wish he just laid out what it meant, what his ministry was really all about in clear language, not instead of him being a part of a story. But I'm like, I don't think there was any other way for there was no other way for him to do that in such a way that was so impactful and to have the most reception possible after his death and resurrection. Because you don't imagine him being like, here's the 95 theses of the Gospels. It wouldn't resonate. It wouldn't actually resonate with our humanity. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, for the reason that even information that looks like it's neutral, it sits inside of a larger story that it can be read neutrally. Well, that's a narrative.
Well, exactly. It's
so I wonder if it's worth unpacking why humans live through narratives and stories in the first place, because all information, anything, is always having an interpretive lens upon it.
Yeah.
I mean, and the interpretive lens is a narrative about what the world is, how we come to know things, why we should know them.
We all have a story. So I was thinking about this, but I probably putting another word around it was actually place.
Yeah,
we're
of course,
always in a place.
Yeah.
And therefore we're trying to figure out the world in a place.
Yeah.
So there is it struck me yesterday. I was in class and one of the students was interesting, and genuinely, he was quite genuine. It was an article they had to read about embodied theology. I wasn't quite sure exactly where he was coming from, so I didn't want to. But it seemed to me that he really loved systematics, but that seemed to float for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, well, what's the part that's missing here? Is place.
Yeah.
Where's the context?
Yeah. Oh, exactly. Where are you standing?
Yeah. So where's, it doesn't mean anything unless there's a context.
But to me, that says something deeply about what it is to be human.
Yeah.
Because as human beings, we're finite creatures that are born into certain families with certain understandings of the world.
Yeah.
We are born into context that shapes how we know things, where we're going to know things, what we can know. But there's something about that might sound restrictive, but it tells you about what it is to be human. To be truly human is to be finite beings. With around people in relationship, already born into relationships that are family traditions, into family lines. So that is what it is to be human. So if that's what it is to be human, but we keep on teaching these huge abstract floating ideas about life that would never touch the person next to me, that's a dehumanizing of what it is to be human. So how are we shepherding our people? How are we teaching our people?
So that prompts me, because I was looking for it just now, and I think it may be quite a helpful thing to actually offer them at some point. Was the diagram that you primarily developed?
I'm thinking out of that diagram.
Can you describe the diagram?
I'm going to give it to you. You guys talk and I'll just find it.
So can you describe the diagram?
Well,
anyone can while you find
describe
it.
Yeah, I haven't looked at it for a while and I need to go back to it. But so I came out with a diagram of four kind of touch points at what it is to be human. So trying to distill it down to its base, to its core.
There you go.
Cool.
And the thing is, because it's in 4, I can't actually see that, but because I don't have my glasses on. But the thing is, they all need to be in play for you to be treating people truly human.
Yeah.
If any one of them is elevated over the other, then you get
distorts.
something less than human. If any one of them is taken away, then you get something that is less than human. They all need to be in play at the same time.
So what Jonathan's describing, and you're seeing on the screen right now, because I'm going to put it up there if we're watching on YouTube, is it looks like a 4-square court, where you play that ball game. And the top left is transcendence, top right freedom, bottom right contingency.
Yeah, good relationships could be there, couldn't it?
It's definitely that. I think I had different descriptions for them all.
And then
I could try and find mine.
Yeah.
Bottom left is material, and then there's a little angelic looking person in the middle touching all 4. in this one at least.
Yeah.
And you're saying that any single one of those is either underemphasized or overemphasized to the detriment of the other.
Exactly. They all need to be in play at the same time. And in fact, what happens is that when you're speaking of one, you're actually always speaking of the other 3. They're implicit, and even if you know that or not, they are. So we could always talk about transcendence, which is what we tend to do.
Yeah.
But implicit in that transcendence, that you're moving away from something. So what are you moving away from? The material world. You're moving away from the finite in order to get the transcendence. Those both have to be in play for it to be talking about the human being. We need to be talking about context as much as we need to be talking about the transcendence of that context. So you can see how, and you could go around and you could do each one of these, and in each one of them, the others are always implicit. And if you elevate them one above the rest, you get something less than human. So they all need to be in play. Yeah.
That's good. And did you just develop that outside of your PhD research or within it?
It was
kind of within it, but it was kind of outside of it.
We were talking about it, wasn't it? And we had this conversation about being human, and then you were sort of ticking away reading what you were reading, and then you started coming out with this and thinking, oh, that's so good.
Yeah.
I actually incorporated it into a course.
Right.
I put this into Faithful Living. I don't know what students, I don't think they've really wrestled with it. But
it's a tricky one.
It's because it's a bit more complicated than, you have to think a bit more deeply about it, and that's just not room in the paper to do that.
That's right. So, and the funny thing is that, I mean, it's based on that actually throughout kind of the historical Western thinking. Aristotle came up with 4 causes.
Yeah.
So he understands that all these 4 causes need to be in play. Heidegger comes up with what is existence. He understands that always 4 causes are usually in play.
Yeah.
So it's a very kind of, it's a model. I've based it on a model of some very deep philosophical kind of thought. But I'm like, well, what does it mean to be human? And these are the 4 causes I think are always at play.
So would we actually speak to that at all?
I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I just...
I'd need to look at it again so I can articulate it better.
Models are always helpful to get to sort of provide some... I mean, always danger about boundaries. You know, boundaries or holding something too tight.
Yeah.
But it's helpful to figure that out and give a frame.
I tell you what's really helpful about it is that you put it up and you say, and I would say this, where's your church strongest?
That's what I was just about to say.
So you can use it.
And you say, okay, this is great. This is great. But have you, to be a truly human, to be, shepherding human people, you need to be thinking about, their material needs, not just what they get in on Sunday morning, but what they need to, where they're living, are they healthy, all those kind of things. So it's we could run it through that grid and say,
I think that'd be helpful.
What are you missing? What are you
emphasizing?
It's
a nice landing space. It gives sort of a bit of it sort of takes it a little from the well, still philosophical, but it just sort of it gives it some form.
Yeah, that's right.
It gives it some form.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think in the end it's Christological. I think that person standing in the middle could either be us or it could be Christ.
Oh, clearly.
Well,
the transcendence in the materials is 100% human, 100% God, and then relationality is the incarnational aspect, and then the freedom bit is transcendence meeting immanence.
Yeah, that's right.
So here's a question.
Sorry.
About in terms of context, because you think, well, why would you want to talk about this? Yes, we can. We say, well, what we're saying, but that's quite opinionated. Yeah. But I think we do have an argument. One argument is actually in the increasing level of the digital world. There's a danger of us. Well, the question is, what does it actually mean to be human?
That's right.
Because we're being transported onto a screen. We can do all sorts of things. We can hold this. We can package that, and we all, it'd be really interesting to know how many of us actually do feel quite kind of. Sometimes alienated. So it's a very good question to ask. What does it mean to be human in the true theological sense?
Exactly. And you know what? I think I have my bugbear is that when we talk about theological anthropology that we start, well, most people assume that we should start with the Imago Dei. Let's start there because that's the theological thing to do. Yeah. I think it's a completely wrong place to start.
Yeah.
I think you start with us. And you work back towards the Imago Dei. That's kind of like the last thing you get to.
Because otherwise, if you start with the Imago Dei, you've already framed your theological frame. You've already,
Well, it's already too abstract.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It's way random.
It's true. It's hard. It's
like, why would you start there?
And so what you're doing there?
Why don't you start with saying, where's your family from? Because if the Imago Dei is anything, it's an enfleshed kind of understanding about what it is to be human. Okay, so let's start. What's your family? What's your family line? Where did they come from? So what's that say about you? Well, I've got Scottish in me, and I've got French in me, and I've got this. That's the traditions that I have been grown into. Yeah. There's something incredibly, godly about that.
Yeah.
That's where God starts with me, with all my kind of material, traditions. Great. Okay, let's start with there. How's God speak through that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you're talking about that, the gospel sort of ring in my mind. Matthew, whole kind of genealogy.
He gives a genealogy.
What's the next one? Mark. What does Mark do? Mark does some of that.
I don't think Mark does.
Matthew, Luke.
Yeah, Matthew, Luke.
Mark jumps right into it.
Yeah,
Mark, that's that fast sort of thing.
But
John's interesting too, because John gives this whole thing of Genesis genealogy that God, the Logos, made flesh.
Yeah,
so you could say that's has a narrative to it too.
Well, that's right. Yeah. Well, one of them gives a deeply kind of human kind of genealogy.
Yeah.
Matthew and Luke.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
John gives Jesus's kind of transcendent genealogy.
Yeah.
So, of course, all these things are at play. Now, you would never just read John, because you'd miss out on the kind of the humanness of Jesus. You'd never just read Matthew and Luke, because then you'd miss out on the transcendent part of Jesus.
Yeah.
That's why we have the synoptics, Gospels. That's why we have them all, because you need
that's
to,
a really good.
you need to
point.
have them all in play. Because if you elevate one, you miss the rest, and you don't get something human or godly.
Yeah.
So this is the thing I think that we miss. We find it very hard to have multiple viewpoints, because we are conditioned in our age to think that truth only comes through one kind of way of knowing. When it's typically that's what we just focus on. How do we know it's true? Because it's a fact in this kind of way. But the Bible is, if anything, it's a little library that shows us that truth must be held in play the whole time. It comes through narrative, it comes through story, it comes through parables, it comes through propositional ways of knowing. But if you elevate one of those, you miss the rest.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to become nimble thinkers again.
That's right. That's
nimble
nice.
truth players.
Yeah.
So I wonder, like, we'll very much just have conversations, and there's 3 sessions, you said.
Yep.
So I think being very concrete around what each of those aims are, so that we don't, because I think this conversation is great, and this is fine, people can listen, but I think if we did a little bit of what we're doing right now, people would be like, so what are we talking about?
Yeah. So we need to settle on how we frame those 3 things. And so go, Joey.
I think it is helpful what you initially said around, well, what does it mean to be human? And then that as an expression of, well, what is the church? And then we'll go a bit tighter again. So it's little, big, well, 2 really big, if you think about biggest topics, but personalized. And then the last one is local church, because that's clearly what the audience cares about. And if they, so I think if that's the framing and that's the understanding, that you can bring in kind of what we've been talking about into all 3 of those categories. But it's important to really segregate those categories just for the simplicity's sake. So if we were to, for the image of God, but if well, not image of God, but for the humanity bit, honestly, if you were to talk about how you can't start with the image of God, you need to let the image of God, Imago Dei, inform the lived experience, in a sense, because you are already born and alive and given existence. So clearly there's something within just your already today lived experience that is the image of God. But there needs to be a sharpening and clarification from Revelation as to, well, why Jesus?
I'm going to be the devil's advocate here, because I'm on your side, but I know from being around systematicians, you're pointing towards a phenomenology rather than a theological systematic. You're starting with a phenomenology rather than a phenomena.
Define phenomenology.
Phenomenology is experience, human reality, lived life, what it actually is, rather than starting, if you start with the image of God, this in the text, so what does this mean? It's an abstraction, it's a systemizing of all that stuff, and then we'll come to that, it'll tell us who we are. What Jonathan's starting from is actually, no, what's our story? So what's the phenomena of that story? What is it?
Instead of starting with a concept and then putting that grid over our lived experience of the world, you start with the lived experience of the world, and you see how our concepts rise up out of that.
Well, I think that's exactly what my research is doing. I'm not going to announce yet.
100%.
Practical theology.
But I'm just saying there are some deep philosophical and theological.
Well, it is, but
massively.
Any practical theologian worth this phrase, worth their salt. They do that.
Yeah.
You don't start from the abstract and work down. You actually identify the experience, the context first.
Yeah.
Or else you don't know what you could speak into.
Yeah. And of course the argument here is that the systematician is doing exactly that too, but they just don't understand that. They don't see that they're already contextualized to even do systematics. It rises out of their lived experience.
It rises out of lived experience.
So, I would agree too. But the argument, because that's what if I was in a wider picture here, that's what would be dished up to me.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Like I remember,
yeah.
here's an example. I remember back in when I was 19, I was at a different family's house, and we were having dinner, and the person knew I went to Bible college, and they loved to ask me these questions. This is the father of the house, and he said, "So why did God tell Abraham to sacrifice Isaac? Like, why would God do that? That's not who God is." And I don't know how at 19 I came up with this answer. I don't know, but I said, well, at that point in history, if we're looking at it as historical, Abraham worshiped multiple gods. He didn't worship one God. He was learning who God was. From his lived experience, he had a context and an I didn't articulate it this well, but this is essentially what I was saying. He had a lived experience, a context as to, well, this is what God would do. God would ask me to sacrifice my child. That's completely normal with the ancient Near Eastern religions of the time and pagan religions. But then God doesn't, and that's the point, So God, you didn't start with God is this. No, God actually started with Abraham's lived experience, and then said, "This is who I am." That's exactly the order of revelation.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, as I mean, I've done quite a bit of reading on this lately, and I would the way that I would probably come to this now, before I would have said, of course, I would probably be very wary of systematics, but I think they're both helpful, phenomenology and systematics, because I think they're implicit in each other. So the phenomenologist is always looking for the absolute, which is what is looking for this kind of meta thing. It's looking for what the transcendent that's out there, but it does it from below, and it works towards. Yeah. Whereas the systematician wants the abstract straight away. It wants the absolute straight away, but implicit in that thing, it can only do it from context. So I think they're implicit in each other, and I think there is a place for us to come to the table and say we're both after the same thing, and we're both coming from it from different ways, but that actually tells us something about what it is to be human.
So the wisdom is in the space again.
Wisdom is in the space. It's in the conversation between those two, and when one is elevated over the other, you get something less than human, because the human is always after transcendence. But we're contextual people. So we're phenomenologists who are also after systematics. And you got to have them both, because otherwise you have something less than human again. Again, it's in the play.
Yeah, it is.
Bill, there's actually a systematic category for that, and it's even systematicians wrestling with it. So my master's systematic theologian back in the day, Bill Brackney, he's passed away now. He was a bit of a radical at a Baptist seminary, which is what I attended, and he said, "Well, where do you begin with theology? Do you begin with the Christ from above or Christ from below?" And those are the two categories. And he said both are completely legitimate. But then as the semester went on, he said you can't have one without the other.
That's exactly it.
Yeah, it's exactly it.
That's exactly it.
Christ from above or Christ from below.
That's exactly
Where
it.
do you begin?
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
It was great.
Yeah. And we need to be as teachers very careful not to fall into to just promoting one over the other.
Yeah.
We need to be careful, man.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you just get everything in play the whole time in flux if you're just a phenomenologist.
Yeah,
everything's always in flux.
Yeah.
Were you...
Yeah. Because the experience is always changing. That's the nature of reality. It just changes and morphs around you. And if you're looking for God in that all the time, it'll change all the time. And you need to be very careful if you're a systematician, where you just have your concept and it never changes. It never gets touched by the real world. Well, that's less than human too.
Did you were you at church when Sam preached 2 Sundays ago?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. I listened to that one 2 days ago, his sermon. Great sermon. I messaged him and said, awesome job. I thought that was great. But one thing I thought was interesting was it was a critique. You could probably clarify for me. It was a critique of God's power. Not critiquing God's power, but a critique of our emphasis of certain aspects of God's activity in the world.
Yep.
And so he said that one end of the spectrum is what his tradition would maybe would err on the side of overemphasizing, which is a diminishing of God's power in the world,
Right.
because it's spooky and kind of not easily understood
Mm-hmm.
and stuff. Where he said the other end of the spectrum is overemphasizing God's power in the
Right.
world through human agents.
Right.
Where it's like, well, God's almost like a tap
Yeah.
that you
yeah,
turn
yeah,
on and off,
Yeah.
and he becomes impersonal
Yeah. Yeah.
at that
yeah,
point.
Yeah.
And that's when I'm like, ooh, I wonder if some ends of the church, the more emphasizing of turning God on and off, saying more,
Yeah,
God,
yeah,
more,
yeah,
more.
yeah.
They
That's a good point.
They potentially they're emphasizing
They're emphasizing.
emphasizing the aboveness
Yeah.
way more to
Yeah.
where God's almost like he's impersonal.
Yeah, exactly right. And then you become less than human, and I think this is where the Proverbs kind of pull us back to like the very practical.
Yeah.
How do you go harvest your grapes? Probably, what's God doing there? There's this practicality.
yeah.
John brings us back to this huge, high kind of view, Christ from above, and Mark's bringing us back to this Christ from below.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the play of those two that you get that the picture of who Jesus is actually starts to emerge from the play between Mark and John. And if you are only a Johannine person, then you're going to miss the humanness of Jesus. If you're only a Markian kind of person, you're going to miss the transcendent of Jesus. And it's in that play, holding them together, that it's kind of like when that bouncing back and forth. Have you ever seen those things that bounce and the image appears in the middle?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And if it falls this way, you lose it. And if it falls this way, you lose it.
Yeah.
There's something about holding the middle.
You know what's happening?
So how do we bring our people to be people that can
So in a kind of
be deeply human and deeply
in a church
Christian
way, when we get to the church one.
Yeah.
See, I wonder the notion of the participation idea really captures your, so as a metaphor.
Exactly.
Because you ask the question, how is this participative?
That's awesome.
That's playing the notion, because it's actually the
That's
participation
true. That's
is
great.
For participants. There has to be at least two.
Oh man, this is
So
good.
top,
This is good.
The top down, the bottom up. So the idea of the language in Christ, participation, draws us into this in a really practical way in our church practice.
That's awesome.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it really does. So what are you saying that, what I'm hearing you saying is that, so you have the speaker at the front, if we're talking really practically on a Sunday, the speaker at the front. Now, there's almost a transcendent quality.
Yes, there is.
Great.
Yeah.
People want to hear the word. They want to hear the
Yeah.
truth being
Yeah.
spoken to them. That's fantastic. But don't forget that they also need to participate in that word, because that's their kind of material, thing. They want the transcendence, but they need to bring their own kind of week to it. They need to bring their body to it. They need to.
The word needs to
unpack it.
walk amongst them.
It needs to walk
So the
amongst
question
them,
is,
which one are you elevating at the moment?
Yeah, and if you were to think about that, how do you participate in that?
Yeah, exactly.
That's a practical question.
Yeah.
How is a congregation participating in this? Particularly, and there's a lot of
that's
theological
pretty
energy under this,
interesting.
because if our understanding of soteriology is participation in the life of Christ, then the question is, then how's this happening in the sermon?
That's so interesting. Here I come back to the wisdom of the Eastern Orthodox,
Right.
where you have the Eucharist happening at the front and the priest giving his stuff, but then he walks from off the stage through the congregation who cross themselves and bow. That's just how they do it.
Yeah.
But the participation of the word, the transcendent word, coming amongst the people and then going back up onto the stage. There's this. Inside of that symbolic thing, it's making us more human. That we see and hear and smell that the transcendent word comes amongst us, but never loses its transcendence and then goes back to the stage. And so the congregation is drawn into the play of life, what it is to be human beings. There's a wisdom in that I think we could learn from.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So I think if we
we
pose more questions than answers, and then when we're in dialogue during the sessions, that's when we can pose some of our own thoughts. So if we structure each of the three talks or conversations with more questions than answers, that would be good. Oh, testing the fire alarm. All right. That'd be good, because then if we if it's we talk together for 20 minutes?
Yep.
And then they talk together for 20 minutes?
Yep.
And then we talk together for 20 minutes. Or however.
And I would probably
that
say
works.
to them, this is the way that we're going to do this. So,
questions, right?
you know, at the beginning is say, look, this is the frame in which we're going to work within. We're going to talk for 20 minutes. Then you have an opportunity in your groups to talk for 20 minutes, and then we're going to have a conversation for 20 minutes.
Yeah, I like that.
Because then they know where they're going. There's a bigger picture there, and it's like...
Should we leave more room for us all talking together? How long is it? Hour long each session?
I don't know. I'll get the times from Nigel.
Because I'm like, if we could make that 30 minutes conversation between everybody, depending on how robust the conversation is, I think it would be, because everyone's got an opinion.
So you're saying 30 minutes for us talking?
No, all of the whole group together.
Yeah.
I don't know. I know 2020 sounds great, but I'm like, it'd be really, I think we just have to feel out in the moment, to be honest. Yeah.
So the first one, because I'll go down, I'll try and type something up. Yeah. What it is to be human, the larger church, and the local church.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then to make it clear at the very beginning.
If I pull up a document and start a draft document, and we can just start typing ideas into that.
Just throw it in there. Yeah.
Okay. I'll do those categories, and then we'll start putting our ideas in there.
Because it's one thing we haven't talked about, which I know we talked about, is mission. That was a big thing. It's just like, we're just talking about we're talking about being, essentially. But like, what is... I think there's... The church as on mission is one of the biggest emphasis within evangelical Christianity, clearly. And it's important. But what does it mean for the church to be on mission is also an element that needs to be focused in. I don't know how that plays into that, because we could get it anyway. I don't know, but I think that needs to be reflected upon in our notes a little bit, because it's going to come across, and we should probably have some thoughts around that.
Some interesting thoughts in my mind starts to go there.
Sitting in the back